Julian traced the condensation on his office window, his finger leaving a clean, stark line through the gray film of the city. 40 floors below, the world moved in a silent, frantic rhythm. A river of yellow cabs and hurried people, all with somewhere to be, someone to meet. For him, there was only this glass box, this stillness, and the muted ache in his chest that had become a permanent resident in the 2 years since Alara was gone. He was the head of a titan of industry, a man whose decisions could ripple through markets, yet he could not command the grief to leave his own heart. It was a stubborn, quiet tyrant. His son, Leo, was the only color in his monochrome world. At 5 years old, Leo was a whirlwind of bright crayon drawings, mismatched socks, and questions that sliced through the heavy silence Julian had built around himself. He was a living, breathing piece of Alara, with her inquisitive eyes and a smile that could, on rare occasions, coax one from Julian's own lips. Protecting that smile was now Julian's sole purpose. This Saturday felt heavier than most. The rain outside matched the gloom inside. Leo, sensing his father's retreat into the fog of memory, had grown restless. He tugged on Julian's hand, his small fingers a warm anchor. "Daddy, can we go for a walk? A puddle walk?" Julian looked down at the boy, a perfect fusion of himself and the woman he had lost. He saw the plea in those wide, hopeful eyes and found he could not refuse them. He nodded, the motion feeling stiff, unused. "All right, little man, a puddle walk it is." They ended up in a part of the city Julian rarely visited, a neighborhood of old brick buildings and independent shops, where the pace seemed a little slower. The rain had softened to a fine mist. Leo, clad in bright yellow rain boots, was in paradise, stomping in every puddle with joyous abandon. Julian watched from the shelter of an awning, a ghost of a smile on his face, feeling the cold seep into his bones. It was the scent that drew them in, cinnamon and baked bread, a warm, sweet cloud that promised refuge from the damp chill. The sign above the door was simple, hand-painted, "The Daily Rise." It looked cozy, unassuming. On impulse, Julian pushed the door open, a small bell chiming their arrival. The inside was a haven of warmth. Soft light glowed from mismatched lamps. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of coffee and sugar, and the low hum of conversation was a gentle balm. Leo's eyes went wide, immediately spotting the glass case filled with cookies and pastries. Julian found a small table in the corner, a quiet vantage point from which to observe. He watched Leo press his nose against the display case, a tiny general surveying his sugary troops. Julian felt a familiar pang of loneliness, a feeling that was sharpest in places like this, places filled with families, with laughter, with the easy warmth of connection. He was an island, and Leo was the only other inhabitant. He was about to call Leo back to the table when the boy turned and toddled toward the counter, where a woman was wiping it down, her back to them. Her hair was gathered in a loose, graceful knot at the nape of her neck. Leo, with the unshakable confidence of a 5-year-old, tugged on her apron. "Excuse me," Leo said, his voice clear and high. The woman turned, a patient smile already forming on her lips, and Julian's world stopped. His breath caught in his throat, a painful, jagged thing. The gentle hum of the cafe faded into a deafening roar in his ears. It was Alara. It was his Alara standing there, alive, breathing, smiling down at their son. The same gentle curve of her jaw, the same constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the same deep, kind eyes that had captivated him from the moment they first met. For a heart-stopping second, he believed in miracles. He thought the universe had corrected its most grievous error. Then his mind caught up. It couldn't be. He had held Alara's hand as she slipped away. He had stood graveside in a cold, unforgiving rain much like this one, This was not a miracle. This was a ghost. Or something else. Clara, Alara's twin sister, they had been estranged, a painful schism after the funeral. Clara had said things in her grief, sharp, cutting things born of unimaginable pain, that he hadn't protected her, that he had taken her away. Julian, lost in his own abyss of sorrow, had not fought back. He had let her go. He hadn't seen or spoken to her in nearly 2 years. He didn't even know she had moved to the city. The woman, Clara, looked from Leo up towards the table, her eyes searching for his parent. Her gaze met Julian's. The polite customer service smile on her face dissolved. Her eyes widened, a flicker of shock, of pain, of something unreadable passing through them. The color drained from her face. She looked as though she had seen a ghost, too. Leo, oblivious to the silent, cataclysmic explosion that had just occurred between the two adults, simply pointed a small finger at Julian. "That's my daddy," he announced proudly. Then he turned back to Clara, his expression one of pure, innocent curiosity. He tilted his head. "Why does my daddy look so sad to see you?" The question, so simple and direct, shattered the fragile silence. It was a question no one had dared ask Julian for 2 years. His colleagues, his friends, they tiptoed around his grief, offering platitudes and respectful distance. But a child sees only the truth. "My daddy looks sad." "Why?" Clara's composure, though shaken, returned in a wave of gentle strength that was so achingly familiar. She knelt down to Leo's level, her movements fluid and graceful. Her voice, when she spoke, was a little unsteady but soft. "Sometimes," she said, her eyes still holding a hint of Julian's, "grown-ups get sad when they see someone who reminds them of a person they miss very much." She looked at Julian, a silent question. In her eyes. "Is it okay?" He could only give a short, jerky nod, his throat too tight to form words. He felt exposed, stripped bare by a child's observation and the sudden, shocking reappearance of a woman who was both a stranger and the closest thing to family he had left. Clara turned her attention back to Leo, her focus entirely on the small boy. "What can I get for you, little man?" she asked, her voice warmer now. "A chocolate chip cookie, please," Leo said, his priorities firmly in order. "The biggest one." Clara's lips curved into a genuine, beautiful smile. It was Alara's smile, but it was also not. There was a faint weariness at the edges, a quiet resilience that was all her own. She stood, selected the largest, most perfect cookie from the case, and placed it on a small plate. As she handed it to Leo, she glanced at Julian again. "It's on the house," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a business decision. It was something else. An offering. A truce. A simple, unsolicited act of kindness, in a moment stretched taut with grief and memory. Julian watched Leo take the plate with 2 hands, his face a mask of pure delight. The boy turned and walked carefully back to the table, setting his prize down with reverence. He broke off a small piece and held it out to Julian. "For you, Daddy." Julian took the piece of cookie. It was warm, the chocolate still slightly melted. He put it in his mouth, the sweetness a jarring contrast to the bitterness in his soul. And then something shifted inside him, a small tectonic plate deep within his frozen heart. It was just a cookie, a simple, imperfectly shaped, homemade cookie, but it was offered with love by his son, and it came from the hands of a woman who looked like his wife. It was a moment of warmth in the unending cold. He looked over at Clara, who was now busy with another customer, her movements efficient and practiced. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the grace in her hands. He had forgotten that about her. He had only remembered the anger and the grief of their last encounter. He had forgotten the kindness. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a genuine smile touched Julian's lips. It wasn't wide, it wasn't happy, but it was real. It was a flicker of light in the profound darkness. a single ripple in a still, stagnant pool. He felt the muscles in his face, unused to this expression, protest slightly. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, the encounter replaying in his mind, the shock of seeing her, the pain in her eyes mirroring his own, the impossible gentleness she showed his son, the simple warmth of the cookie. He drove home through the slick city streets, Leo humming contentedly in his car seat, and felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. That night, after he tucked Leo into bed, he stood in his silent, cavernous living room. The apartment was a monument to his success. Clean, lines, expensive art, a view that cost a fortune. It was also sterile, empty, a place where echoes went to die. He had thought that was what he wanted, a quiet, orderly fortress to contain his grief. Now it just felt cold. He found himself thinking about the little cafe, the mismatched furniture, the smell of cinnamon, the low hum of life. It was everything his home was not. It was warm. It was real. A week passed. Julian went through the motions of his life. Board meetings, market analyses, quarterly reports. The numbers on the screen were abstract and meaningless. The conversations were hollow. He found his mind drifting constantly back to that rainy Saturday, to a hand-painted sign and a face he thought he would never see again. He told himself it was about Leo. The boy had asked about the cookie lady every day. He deserved to know his aunt, the only living link to the mother he would never remember. It was his duty as a father. That was the logical, responsible reason. But Julian knew in a quiet, unexamined corner of his heart that it was for him, too. He was drawn to that warmth, that flicker of life he had felt. The following Saturday, the sun was bright, a stark contrast to the week before. Julian found himself driving not to the park, not to a museum, but back to that neighborhood of old brick buildings. He parked the car, his heart hammering against his ribs with a nervous rhythm. "Are we going to see the cookie lady?" Leo asked, his voice filled with excitement. "Yes, Leo," Julian said, his own voice sounding distant. "We are." He pushed open the door, the same bell announcing their arrival. The cafe was busier today, bathed in sunlight. Clara was behind the counter, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked up as the bell chimed, and her eyes found his immediately. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a quiet, guarded welcome. He didn't approach the counter. He just took the same corner table, a silent regular claiming his spot. Leo, however, had no such reservations. He ran straight to the counter, beaming up at his aunt. "I'm back," he declared. Clara's guarded expression melted when she looked at Leo. A soft, genuine smile lit up her face. "So I see," she said, leaning over the counter. "And what will it be today, sir?" This became their routine. Every Saturday, Julian would bring Leo to the Daily Rise. He would sit at his corner table with a black coffee that he rarely finished, and he would watch. He watched Clara interact with her customers, a kind word for everyone. He watched her hands as she worked, kneading dough or decorating a cake with focused precision. He watched the way she always had a special smile just for Leo. He became a quiet fixture in her world, a distant, silent observer. He learned the rhythm of her shop, the morning rush, the quiet lull of the afternoon, the friendly chatter of the regulars. He was careful to keep his distance, not wanting to presume, not wanting to push. This fragile, unspoken truce felt too important to risk. Leo, of course, recognized no such boundaries. He had adopted Clara completely. He would bring her his crayon drawings, sprawling, colorful masterpieces of dinosaurs and rocket ships. One Saturday, he presented her with a drawing of 3 stick figures under a smiling sun. A tall one labeled Daddy, a small one labeled Leo, and a woman with curly hair labeled Cookie Lady. Clara had accepted the drawing with a seriousness that honored the gift. She looked at it for a long moment, her finger tracing the figure meant to be her. A flicker of something, sadness maybe, or longing, passed through her eyes before she smiled at Leo. "This is beautiful, Leo. I'm going to put it up right here." She taped it to the wall behind the counter, a place of honor next to the cash register. Julian watched the exchange from his table, his heart a confusing mix of warmth and sorrow. He was glad Leo had her. He was terrified of what it meant for himself. Seeing her week after week was like living with a constant low-grade ache. It was a reminder of all he had lost, but it was also, terrifyingly, becoming a source of light he was starting to depend on. One afternoon, as they were leaving, Leo, running ahead, tripped on an uneven patch of sidewalk just outside the cafe door. He went down hard. The wail that followed was instantaneous and heart-wrenching. Before Julian could even get out of his chair, Clara was there. She had rounded the counter in a flash and was kneeling on the sidewalk beside Leo, her voice calm and soothing. "Oh, sweet boy, let's have a look." Julian reached them a second later, his own heart pounding with parental panic. Leo's knee was scraped, bleeding slightly, but it was clear he was more frightened than hurt. Clara handled it with a gentle competence that stunned Julian into silence. She murmured comforting words to Leo, her hand stroking his back. "That was a big surprise, wasn't it? You were flying so fast your feet couldn't keep up." She pulled a handkerchief from her apron pocket and gently dabbed at the scrape. Then she looked up at Julian. "I have a first aid kit inside." Julian could only nod. He watched as she helped Leo up and led him back into the cafe, settling him on a chair. She returned with a small box, from which she produced an antiseptic wipe and a colorful bandage with cartoon animals on it. She cleaned the scrape with an efficiency that suggested long practice, her voice never losing its soft, reassuring tone. "There," she said, smoothing the bandage onto his knee. "A badge of honor. You were very brave." She then produced a small, star-shaped sugar cookie from her pocket. "For medicinal purposes." Leo, his tears already forgotten, took the cookie with a sniffle and a wobbly smile. Julian stood by, feeling useless, feeling overwhelmed. He had seen his wife comfort a crying child 1,000 times. Seeing Clara do it with the exact same innate gentle grace was like a punch to the gut, but it was also comforting. He saw her not as Alara's reflection, but as herself, a kind, capable woman who had calmed his crying child. As they prepared to leave for the second time, Clara pressed a small, folded napkin into Julian's hand. "For later," she whispered, her eyes meeting his for a brief, significant moment. He waited until he was in the car to open it. Inside the napkin was another star-shaped cookie, and tucked into the fold was a small, handwritten note. It said, "Welcome to the Kind Friends Club. Leo is the president. You and I are the only other members." Julian stared at the note, at the neat, elegant handwriting that was so different from Alara's looping script. A small, simple gesture, an acknowledgement, an invitation into their small world, not as a customer, not as a ghost from the past, but as a friend. He held the note in his hand the entire drive home, the paper growing soft from the warmth of his palm. The Saturdays continued, but something had shifted. The distance between his corner table and her counter seemed to shrink. Sometimes, if the cafe was quiet, she would bring him his coffee herself, and they would exchange a few words. They talked about the weather, about the city, about Leo. Safe topics. They never spoke of Alara. Her name was a silent, sleeping dragon in the room, and neither of them dared to wake it. But her presence was always there. One afternoon, Julian found himself talking about his parents, who had passed away years ago. He spoke of his father's quiet strength, something he tried to emulate. Clara listened, her chin resting on her hand. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My sister," she began, her voice soft, and Julian's breath hitched. It was the first time she had mentioned her. Elara used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go. It just pools inside you. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the echo of his own pain in her eyes. She was right, he whispered. That day the sleeping dragon had stirred, but it had not breathed fire. It had only sighed, a sad, mournful sound that they both heard. The wall between them, built of shared loss and unspoken words, had developed its first crack. A few weeks later, a different kind of crisis struck. Julian was in a late afternoon meeting, a tense negotiation with a rival firm, when his phone buzzed. It was Clara. He rarely got calls from her. They communicated through Saturday visits. He excused himself immediately, a cold dread washing over him. "Julian," she said, her voice strained. "I'm sorry to bother you at work, but it's Leo." His blood ran cold. "What's wrong? Is he okay?" "He has a fever," she explained, her voice tight with worry. "A high one. It came on so fast. He was fine this morning, but now he's just so listless. I called his pediatrician, and they said to bring him in, but I don't have a car, and a taxi will take forever in this traffic, and I'm on my way," Julian said, cutting through her panicked rambling. There was no hesitation. "Don't move. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He walked back into the boardroom where some of the most powerful executives in the city were waiting for him. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and absolute, "this meeting is over. My son needs me." He walked out without another word, leaving a room of stunned silence in his wake. The drive to her small apartment above the cafe was a blur of blaring horns and aggressive lane changes. He found her in the living room, cradling a flushed, miserable-looking Leo in her arms. The boy was wrapped in a blanket, his eyes glassy with fever. Julian scooped his son into his arms. The heat radiating from the small body was alarming. "Let's go," he said, his tone all business, a mask for the fear churning in his gut. At the doctor's office, they were a team. He handled the paperwork, his mind sharp and focused, while Clara held Leo, murmuring soft comforts, stroking his hot forehead. They sat together in the sterile waiting room, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a shared, anxious purpose. He found himself watching her, the gentle way she cared for his son, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It turned out to be a nasty flu bug. The doctor prescribed medication and rest. By the time they got back to Clara's apartment, Leo was exhausted but on the mend, the fever already starting to break. Julian carried him inside and laid him down on Clara's sofa, tucking a quilt around him. Clara stood in the doorway, watching them. Her apartment was small and cozy, filled with books and plants. It felt like her. It felt like a home. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done." "You would have figured it out," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You always do." He looked at her, at the exhaustion and relief warring on her face. "But you don't have to do it alone." He stayed until Leo was sleeping soundly. As he was preparing to leave, the little boy stirred. He opened his sleepy eyes and looked at his father, then at Clara, who was standing nearby. A small, contented smile touched his lips. "I like it when you're here, Daddy," he mumbled, his voice drowsy. "And Auntie Clara, too, it's nice." He closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. The simple, sleepy words landed in the quiet room with the weight of a revelation. "It's nice." Leo felt it, the rightness of it. Julian looked at Clara, and he saw that she had heard it too. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. In that moment, watching his son sleep peacefully under the watchful eye of this incredible woman, Julian realized the truth. His heart, which he had thought was broken beyond repair, was slowly, quietly starting to heal. and Clara was the reason. The next few months saw a subtle but profound shift. Julian's visits were no longer confined to Saturdays. He'd stop by the cafe on a Tuesday just to bring her a specific type of tea she'd once mentioned she liked. He'd leave an umbrella hanging on her door on a day the forecast promised rain. Small, observant gestures that said, "I see you, I'm thinking of you." Clara, in turn, began to let her guard down. She would save him a warm croissant from the morning batch. She started sending him home with meals, knowing he barely cooked for himself. They were orbiting each other, closer and closer, pulled by a gentle, undeniable gravity. Clara found herself watching him more, too. She saw the way his shoulders relaxed when he was in her cafe, the way the deep lines of stress around his eyes seemed to soften. She saw the unguarded joy on his face when he played with Leo. She was starting to see the man behind the grief, the kind, steady, gentle man who had been there all along. And she realized with a feeling that was equal parts terrifying and wonderful, that she was falling in love with him. She was falling in love with her sister's husband. The thought was a tangled knot of guilt and hope. One rainy afternoon, Julian found her in the back of the shop, staring at a letter, her face pale. A customer, a notoriously difficult man, had slipped on the wet floor earlier, and though he was fine, he was now threatening a lawsuit, claiming negligence. It was a frivolous, cruel threat, but for a small business owner like Clara, it was a terrifying prospect. She looked utterly defeated. "You don't have to be strong all the time, you know," Julian said softly from the doorway. Her composure crumbled. The tears she had been holding back finally fell. He didn't try to offer solutions or platitudes. He just stood there, his presence a silent, solid support, giving her the space and permission to finally be vulnerable. He stayed until her tears subsided, a quiet guardian in the storm. The next day, Clara received a call. The man was dropping his lawsuit. He offered no explanation, just a curt, mumbled apology. Clara was bewildered but relieved. She didn't know that Julian had made a single phone call to his legal team, who had, in turn, made a very persuasive call to the man, gently explaining the folly of trying to extort a friend of one of the most powerful men in the city. Julian never mentioned it. He just wanted the worry gone from her eyes. The real storm arrived a week later, not in the form of a disgruntled customer, but in a crisp, formal envelope, delivered by a courier. It was from Alara's parents. They had learned of his growing closeness to Clara. In their own twisted grief, they saw it as a betrayal, a final erasure of their daughter's memory. They were petitioning the court for full custody of Leo, claiming Julian was an unstable guardian, unfit to raise their grandchild. The letter felt like a physical blow. The thought of losing Leo, the one bright light in his life, was unimaginable. It was a cruel, calculated attack aimed at the very heart of his world. He felt the old, familiar coldness creep back in, the grief and anger twisting in his gut. He knew he had to tell Clara. This concerned her too. They had named her in the petition, accusing her of conspiring with him to replace their daughter. He found her at the cafe after closing time. He laid the documents on the counter between them, the stark black and white of the legal jargon, a blight on the warm, welcoming space. He watched her read, saw her hands begin to tremble, saw the color drain from her face as she reached the accusations leveled against her. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and fury. "How could they?" she whispered. "After everything, how could they use their own grandson as a weapon?" "Because they're hurting," Julian said, his voice heavy. "And they want me to hurt too." He saw the fear for him, for Leo, in her eyes. He also saw her pulling away, her old defenses rising. He saw her preparing to retreat, to protect herself by isolating herself. He couldn't let that happen. "I've already hired the best family law attorney in the state," he told her, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "They will handle this." Clara shook her head, a familiar, weary self-reliance hardening her expression. "Julian, you can't just throw money at this. This is your fight. I shouldn't be involved. I'll only make it worse for you." He reached across the counter and, for the first time, took her hand. His touch was firm, steady. Her skin was cold. "Clara, look at me." He waited until her frightened eyes met his. "This is not just my fight. They made it our fight when they put your name on that paper, when they attacked you." He squeezed her hand gently. "For the past 2 years, you have been protecting Leo's heart. You've given him a warmth and a connection to his mother that I never could. You did that all on your own. You are the strongest person I know." He paused, his gaze intense, his voice dropping to a low, sincere pitch. "You protect his heart. Let me protect you. Let me protect our family. Our family." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a declaration. Clara stared at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity, his strength. For her entire life, she had been the caregiver, the strong one, first for her more fragile sister, then for herself, after the world fell apart. No one had ever offered to be strong for her. Not like this. Not with such quiet, unwavering certainty. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, a silent, profound acceptance. In that simple touch, a new reality was forged. They were no longer two separate people navigating a shared grief. They were a unit, a team, a family. The legal battle was brutal but swift. Julian's lawyers were methodical, dismantling the grandparents' case with quiet precision. But the true victory came during the custody hearing. Clara took the stand, not as a witness for Julian, but as a party to the case. She spoke with a calm, heartfelt eloquence about her sister, about her love for her nephew, and about the healing she had witnessed in both Julian and Leo. "Grief is not a competition," she said, her clear gaze fixed on Alara's parents. "And love isn't a finite resource. Loving my nephew doesn't diminish my love for my sister. Seeing Julian happy again doesn't erase her memory. It honors it. Alara would have wanted her son to be surrounded by love, not by bitterness." The judge dismissed the petition, his ruling a stern rebuke of the grandparents' actions. Walking out of the courthouse, Julian and Clara stepped into the bright sunlight, their hands still linked. The weight that had been pressing down on them for weeks had finally lifted. They didn't speak of it again. The victory was quiet, personal. The real change was in them. The final barrier had fallen. There was no more pretense, no more hesitation. A few months later, Julian stood on a stage in front of a crowd of city officials and philanthropists. He was dedicating a new community center, a beautiful building with a library, an art studio, and a teaching kitchen. It was a project he had funded anonymously, pouring millions into its creation. He looked out at the crowd, at Clara and Leo standing in the front row. Leo was holding a small, framed crayon drawing. Clara was watching him, her eyes shining with pride and love. "This center is named the Alara Project," Julian said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "It's named for my late wife, a woman who believed in the power of community, in second chances, and in the simple kindness of strangers." He paused, his gaze finding Clara's. "But it was inspired by someone else. It was inspired by a woman who showed me that, even after the deepest loss, it's possible to build something new and beautiful. A woman who runs a small bakery, but who has built a true community around her, with nothing more than warmth, grace, and an open heart." He stepped down from the stage, ignoring the applause, and walked directly to his family. He knelt in front of Leo. "This is for you, little man," he said, handing him a small, ornate key. It's the key to the front door. This place is as much yours as it is mine. I will always be here to open doors for you. I promise." Leo beamed and hugged his father tightly. Then Julian stood and turned to Clara. The crowd faded away. There was only her. "Clara," he said, his voice full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "For 2 years I lived in a gray world. You and Leo brought the color back. You taught me how to breathe again. I love you. Not as a replacement for what I lost, but as the woman you are. I love you for your strength, for your kindness, for the flower that's always on your cheek. I want to build a life with you, with Leo. I want to be your family." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face, but she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful smile that was all her own. "I love you too, Julian," she whispered. She reached up and touched his face, her hand warm and sure. "We already are a family." The final scene of their story did not take place in a grand hall or a courthouse, but on a quiet Tuesday morning. They returned to the place where it all began. The daily rise. The bell chimed as they entered, not as a customer and a proprietor, not as ghosts of the past, but as a family. Julian sat at their corner table, but this time Clara sat with him, her hand resting comfortably in his. Leo was helping behind the counter, a tiny apron tied around his waist, carefully placing sprinkles on a cupcake. Julian looked around the warm, sunlit cafe. He looked at the woman beside him, her presence a steady, comforting warmth. He looked at his son, happy and whole. Taped to the wall behind the counter next to the cash register was a new drawing from Leo. It was the same 3 stick figures, a tall man, a small boy, and a woman with curly hair. But this time they were all holding hands, and underneath, in a child's wobbly script, Leo had written a new title, not Cookie Lady. He had written Mom, and on the front door of the cafe, a new, small, hand-painted sign had appeared. It was in Clara's elegant script, a quiet testament to their journey. It read, "Home is not a place, it's the people who stay.